So I'd just like to welcome you all here. This is our 6th In Conversation, one of our most popular events. Carole is a veteran now of Boyle Musical Society and a very good friend. And over the years she's interviewed Miriam O'Callaghan, Geraldine Kennedy, Senator David Norris. And this year we have Kingston Mills with us. So without any further ado, I'll introduce you to Carole. Carole?
Thank you, Brendan, and hello, everybody. And it's actually really surreal to see real people sitting at an arts festival instead of looking through some tiny little screen at people. So welcome. It's great to have you here. It really, really is. And thanks to Brendan for organising this, because I know at the last minute they had to kind of reupholster it, as he said, from an indoor event to an outdoor event. And I know those things are not easy to do. So we're a smaller group than usual. Up at the church we would have had about, 250? But let's just call it an intimate evening then, which is very good. And I'm going to chat to our guest for about 45 minutes, and then I'm sure you'll have some questions given the topic that he's known for at the moment. So think of your questions, and we'll save a bit of time at the end for those questions. So I suppose up to 18 months ago, this evening's guest would have been diligently working away in his office in Trinity College Dublin, leading his research teams and starting up new research companies and writing about his chosen field. But since March 2020, he has become a household name and face across this country, because with his expert knowledge of what we're going through, he has guided us through the pandemic so far, and no doubt will continue to do so as we progress to the next phases of this extraordinary time in our history. So he is Professor of Experimental Immunology in the School of Biochemistry and Immunology at Trinity College Dublin. And would you please welcome Kingston Mills.
Big thanks to the Boyle Arts Festival Committee and to Brendan, Belinda and others for inviting me. I feel sort of almost a fraud being here. This is the name of all the previous people that Carole has interviewed over the last number of years. So I'm delighted to be here. I've been coming to Boyle for around 40 years. And I suppose I know the place pretty intimately, and anyone who's seen me out on the bicycle will know that I've been cycled all the roads of Boyle and the countryside for years. So yeah, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks very much.
You're very welcome. And I get to ask just like one really frivolous question. So this is it. Where did you get the name Kingston? Because it's not often in Ireland you find anybody called Kingston.
Well, it's actually my mother's maiden name. She was from West Cork, and Kingston is a very popular surname in West Cork. And that's how I got the name. It was an old tradition that in Protestant families that they would try and keep the name of the mother by calling, if appropriate, it wasn't always appropriate to give a name of a surname to an offspring, but that's how I got the name.
Have you ever been to Kingston Mills in Ontario?
I have indeed, actually. I visited Toronto a few times, and I went down to Kingston Mills, and in fact a friend, Marina, my wife, was sitting in the front row there. She got a T-shirt from a friend and it said, "Where the hell is Kingston Mills?" And this was from Kingston Mills.
I'm surprised they didn't give you the freedom of the city or the canal or whatever it is they have up there. And I did forget to mention that your better half, Marina Lynch, is from Boyle here, so that is your Boyle connection. And she has an event tomorrow. She's also in the science field, so she has an event here tomorrow. So where in Ireland then are you from? Where did you grow up? Where did you go to school?
So I was born I'm the son of a farmer, born in County Westmeath, outside Mullingar. Went to the local, one of the local primary schools in Mullingar, and went to secondary school again locally in a small village called Multifarnham, which is just off the Sligo-Dublin road. And it was mainly a school for farmers' sons in those days. It wasn't the most academic school in the world, and I remember I was the first pupil in the school ever to have done honours maths in the Leaving Cert. And I mean, it's hard to believe, isn't it? There was the teacher couldn't teach honours maths because he hadn't had the proficiency to teach honours maths. So I had to actually teach myself maths. And my mother was astute enough to realise that I was struggling. And she organised grinds for me during the summer of before the last year. And that was sort of set me up. And I just scraped an honour and managed to get again, one of only 3 kids in the school to go to university that year. So, and would have been very rare for kids in the school to go to university at that time.
Yeah.
This was in the 1970s. And as I say, most of them were farmers' sons who went home to be farmers.
Yeah.
So it was quite an odd situation to be in. I had an older brother, so he was going to be the farmer. So I wasn't going to go home to the farm, and I had to find something else to do.
Yeah.
So being a scientist was what ended up with.
And of course, at the time when you were younger as well, you were very much into athletics, which was kind of it was in your family, the athletics. Just tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so my father had been an international runner, and he had represented Ireland in the World Cross Country a couple of times. He won the National Cross Country Championship in the 1930s. And I was I was into all sports as a kid, played rugby, and I played rugby right up to university level. Looking at me now, you might wonder, looking at the All Blacks and the Springboks, what in those days, schools rugby was for. They did have the odd person that had a bit of speed as well as brawn. So it was. I did play rugby, but I also ran, and running was sort of obviously in the genes. And I found a niche there. I started off as a sprinter actually in the early days in early school, but I didn't really take it seriously until I went to university, and then I took it a bit more seriously. But I was still playing a bit of rugby, and then ended up finding that I was getting injured in rugby. I wasn't really cut out for it, wasn't big enough, so I stuck to running.
And you chose marathons, which is like the endurance one. Why marathons?
Well, I mean, I didn't start initially at marathons. So when I started my running career seriously, I was running cross country and track. I mean, I ran for Ireland on the track. I ran for Ireland in the World Cross Country twice. And then, as you get older, your speed sort of decreases and your endurance increases. So you tend to move up distances. So I ended up eventually moving up to the marathon. That was only towards the very end of my career. I only ever ran 5 marathons because I got injured. And had to curtail my career when I was in my mid-30s. But I ran enough to make it onto the Irish team for the World Championships, and also qualified for the Olympics, but didn't.
Tell us about that. What happened in that? That was the year 1984, the Los Angeles Olympics. You were almost there. How close did you get?
It was incredible. I mean, it's very rare and for the last, since Ireland was representing the Olympics, there was never been more than 3 runners in a marathon at the Olympics. And that year there were 4 people there were only 3 people who had the qualifying time, and I was one of them. But John Tracy, who had been selected for the 10,000, and of course went on to get the silver medal in the marathon, decided to opt for running the marathon as well. He was entitled to do that because he had qualified through the 10,000. So I was bumped off the team. Because he decided he would run. So I missed out because John was put on the team, but he got the silver medal, so I can't really feel bad about it. And in fact, there were 2 other athletes in that race that did remarkably well. Jerry Kiernan, who sadly passed away last year, who you might know from being an RTE commentator as well, he came 10th in that race, and Dick Hooper was 22nd. And now you might think that 22nd is not good for an Olympic position, but let me tell you, 22nd in the marathon, the Olympics is an unbelievable performance.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, we see what's going on now at the Olympics at the moment, and sometimes the Irish runners get knocked out early on, but and you think, that's a disappointment. It is a disappointment for them, but if they run their personal bests and they do well. I mean, we're listening to something on the radio on the way down about track and field. I mean, track and field is something that almost every country in the world does. So you're competing with every country in the world, whereas things like rugby and other sports where there's only a tiny numbers of countries that compete. Track and field is for everybody because you don't need facilities to do it. So Ireland does very well comparatively, even though we won't get any medals in the track and field.
Right. What was your own personal best for a marathon? Can I ask?
2 hours 13 and some seconds.
Very good.
Which
Very good.
which I mean, you know, for someone who's run a marathon, you know that's a reasonable time. But for me, that was about 5 minutes behind the world record at the time, and that's a long way. So I would have been about a mile behind the world record holder in the marathon. So, but it was, again, the guys that were up at the front of the field in terms of world rankings, and I would have been ranked in the top 50 in the world during my peak in the marathon, and I came 22nd in the world marathon in Rome. So that would have been sort of the level that I was at. But I was a full-time scientist as well as being.
You never thought of this as an early career, did you?
Well, I mean, I told you it. In fact, when I was in school, one of the options, in those days there was no CEO points. You just applied to university and you got picked on the basis of, or not, the basis of your leaving cert. And I applied to go to Trinity to do science. I also applied to Limerick to do PE because I was so interested in sport. And I got accepted for both. And then I had to toss up. None of my family had ever been at university, so I didn't really have anybody to talk to about it. And I just sort of talked to myself about it, decided that, you know, when I reached 40, I could be, you know, injured or, you know, not interested in sport anymore. And, you know, whereas with science, it's something that's going to be with me for life. And I chose science. But I was still able to keep the running going with the science career. And I was juggling, you know, being an international athlete with being, trying to develop my career as a scientist. And at the time, we in fact, we had our first kids. So Tim, our son, was born, and Marina. I won the national marathon, I think, about 1983 or 4. And when was Tim born? My son. 86. He wasn't born in 86, was he?
Oh, the running isn't good for the brain. Oh, come on.
Right, I got that one wrong. Anyway, he was about a few weeks old when I ran the marathon, and Marina had him in a sling. She was running around the course shouting at me. So we were trying to balance at that stage, bringing up a family, 2 scientific careers, and me trying to be an international athlete. So it was tricky. And you then compare that with most of the runners today are all professional. None of them are. Yeah. I mean, some of them are getting, you know, big money for appearing in Diamond League meetings, etc. But others are getting subventions from their governing bodies. So they're not running. They're not working as well as running.
Yeah, it's a different business this time. So what exactly is your scientific field like? How would you explain it to the man or the woman on the street?
So I'm an immunologist. So immunology is all about the immune system and how this fights infection. So obviously that's why I'm so interested in COVID-19 and SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes this disease. So I've been working. I started, my PhD in immunology in Trinity, and that's when I met Marina. She was working in physiology, and I was working on bone marrow transplantation. So bone marrow transplantation was really in its infancy. I was in the lab that did the first bone marrow transplant in Ireland, and that was in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and then I went from there to London and started working in cancer immunology, and then moved to a place called Mill Hill, which is the National Institute of Medical Research, which is now the Crick Institute, and got interested in influenza virus. Mm-hmm. So the immunology of how the body responds to the virus, and how, interestingly, and this is why I'm so interested in SARS-CoV-2, how the virus mutates and changes and then can evade the immune response. And that's exactly what's happening with the current virus causing the COVID pandemic. And that was what I did my postdoctoral training on for 5 years. I worked exclusively on influenza virus with one of the world authorities on influenza virus, a guy called Sir John Scahill. And he was head of the institute that I worked in. So that's how so immunology is really about understanding how the immune system takes care of infection, how we fight infection, but also sometimes when the immune system gets dysregulated, it goes, uncontrolled and can cause diseases like arthritis or multiple sclerosis or psoriasis. These are autoimmune diseases. So we study those as well. My lab works on multiple sclerosis as well as working on immunity to infection. And we're involved in a lot of work, some with companies, some with collaborating doctors in the hospitals looking at patients with MS.
Right. And can I just ask you, I remember where I was when I first heard of, you know, the COVID virus. I remember we had gone to see my mother-in-law in Chicago, and I was in bed with this awfully sore throat, like the worst I'd ever had. And I was listening to NPR radio and hearing about this virus in Wuhan, in China, and the hazmat suits and all the people being taken off the streets and everything. Did you know straight away that this was going to be a significant thing in our lives, or did it take a while for it to sink in?
Yeah, to be perfectly honest, I didn't think it was going to hit the pandemic level that it did, but I started getting worried a few weeks into when the stories were coming out of China, and the extent of the spread of it, how quickly, even though in fact China never really had it very badly because they reacted so quickly and so well to it. It was really only when it got to other countries that everyone started to worry. And then when we had the first case in Europe, we knew, I knew it was going to come to Ireland, and I wasn't a bit surprised, you know, when the first case was announced in Ireland. I knew then we were in for the long haul.
Yeah.
So it took a while for us all to actually, you know, realise this is not another Ebola, or there was another SARS virus that causes a SARS disease in Africa. But that was a very lethal virus, and it killed a lot of people. And luckily this one isn't. But in fact, being a very lethal virus means it doesn't spread as much because it kills its host. And a good virus doesn't kill its host. It keeps its host alive so that it can spread to other people. And that's why SARS-CoV-2 is actually a more successful virus.
It's a good virus.
A very successful virus.
Right. And I mean, some of the early predictions here even were quite frightening. I mean, we heard numbers like that 40,000 people might die, 400,000 would get it. That latter one seems to have come true almost. I think we're at 300,000 now. But did you ever fear that it might turn into a 1918 flu type thing?
I didn't think it would turn into a 1918 flu, because the trouble with the 1918 flu, not only was it a very serious virus, but there was actually no medical intervention that could deal with it. And we knew that, you know, we didn't think, I mean, to be honest, I didn't think a vaccine would be developed as quickly as it was. But we knew that medical intervention would help to lessen the blow. And we knew it wasn't as killer a virus as something like Ebola. Mm-hmm. So, you know, with proper medical conditions, we knew that perhaps there would a significant number of people would die. I have to say, I did think that some of the predictions were a little outrageous from some people, you know, in terms of numbers. And I won't. Well, maybe I will mention one name. There's one colleague. Don't mention the name. My wife was saying. There's one medical colleague who.
Well, that's probably the one I was quoting there, because there was a lot of, you know, talk about it at the time, and it obviously it didn't pan out. But were there any other big mistakes made either globally or locally? You know, false assumptions made about the virus because it was so new. Like, looking back now, was there any big mistake that everybody made?
Yeah, I mean, look, you know, it's easy to look back and hindsight and be clever and say you should have done this, you should have done that, and it's very easy to criticise as well. I mean, the HSE and the Department of Health come in for a lot of criticism, including from myself, I have to say, and I wasn't short on criticising them when I felt it was necessary to criticise them, because there had to be independent voices that were. There is a real worry when a lot of public health doctors, and I hope there are no public health doctors in the audience, when they don't look at getting opinion from outside their own area, and then it becomes group speak, and they get locked into a way of thinking, and that can be dangerous. So it is important for independent people. That's really what motivated me to speak out on a number of occasions and to write articles, for example, opinion pieces of the Irish Times, which I've written a few times about it, to try and give an independent voice and to give people, you know, an independent. I have no axe to grind. I have no association with the HSE, the Department of Health, or any of these organisations. So, you know, I would consider myself a completely independent voice on this, and that's why I've spoken as much as I have.
So that would have been our biggest mistake, that we maybe fell into some groupthink, or...
We did, and we also got, it became political, because, you know, the interaction between NIFET and the Department of Health and the Minister and the government, you know, there was a lot of friction there at times, and, you know, the government would be blaming NIFET for restrictions, and NIFET would be recommending to the government to do this. So there was tension a lot of the way, and there still is, on this. And the biggest mistakes that were made early on were to do with travel. I mean, we could have kept out. It would have inevitably, you know, I never believed in zero COVID, and there were some of my colleagues that have put forward those plans. And I actually wrote an article in The Conversation over a year ago, how I thought that zero COVID was impossible. So I never bought into that idea. I didn't think we ever could achieve it, but we could have kept out the virus early on if we had acted quicker. I was shouting in the media for closing the airports and not having St. Patrick's Day parades, cancelling the rugby match, stopping the supporters from Italy coming here, stopping the flights from Northern Italy. All of those things weren't done, and that accelerated the epidemic in Ireland. And then when we had the Delta variant, I made the same warnings: if you don't close the flights for the countries that have the Delta variant now, we're going to get the Delta variant and it's going to take over. And of course it did. Now, it might not have been possible to stop it anyway, but we certainly could have delayed it and we could have reduced the numbers if they had listened, but they didn't.
Okay, and we see tonight that the numbers are higher than they've been in a long time. I think it's 1,700 cases tonight. So, I mean, are we winning this or are we losing it? What do you think?
Okay, so I'd like to be optimistic about it, and the 1,782 cases today, I would imagine that about 400 or 500 of those are asymptomatic, so they've virtually no symptoms. Because when you do a test, you're testing for the virus in people that might have COVID-19. In fact, they're not COVID-19 patients, those 1,782. There are 1,782 people that have tested positive for the virus, and some of them have no symptoms. And the vast majority of them, not all of them, are young. So they're either 18 to 24-year-olds, 24 to 30, or 12 to 18. And the numbers in the 12 to 18 group are increasing all the time. And that's simply because all the people in the older age group, the vast majority have been vaccinated. So the vaccines really are working. And I'm optimistic that when we have all the adult population vaccinated, or close to all of it, probably 95%, the uptake in Ireland has been fantastic. We are one of the best countries in Europe.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that. Why do you think that we are top of the class?
I think there's a number of reasons. I think the Irish public have a great appetite for listening to what the science, what the scientists are saying, and they have bought into the idea that the vaccine is going to protect them, and they trust the doctors, which is good.
And everyone has really been in agreement on that. There has been no other...
There's been no disagreement on that amongst the scientists, there's been disagreements about aspects of it. Yeah. But by and large, everybody has put forward the really positive nature of how the vaccines have been our saviour. So what's going to happen? Why are we at 782 today? And that's simply because what has happened is we've opened up the restrictions, and more people are meeting, especially younger people, and it's such an incredibly transmissible virus, the Delta variant, that even putting 5 or 6 people in a room together when one of them has infected, everybody's going to get infected. That's just inevitable now. And that's why once it's in a household, that whole household are going to get it, and there's no way around it. So, but the good news is that a lot of those cases are very mild. Some of them, as I said, are asymptomatic. Others are very mild. A lot of them will not. That vast majority will not end up in hospital. There's a small number that will, and this is one gripe I have with the HSE. They're not giving us the data right now on the spread of ages of those in hospital. So I'm gleaning this from colleagues, medical colleagues, and I'm gleaning it from journalists who actually are, have other ways of finding out this information. Yeah. And so it appears that there's a broad spread of ages, even though this isn't in the public domain. They're not giving it in the daily briefings. There's a broad spread of ages of people in hospital, right up to people over 60. But there's also 3 children I know last week were in Cromlin Hospital with COVID-19. That means that they're children, that they're not adults. Yeah. So there's a range of ages in hospital. Now, some of those will be people who chose not to get vaccinated or haven't yet been vaccinated, the older ones that decided not to get vaccinated. Others, a small minority, that are what are called vaccine breakthroughs, where they have been vaccinated but they haven't responded to the vaccine. And the vaccines are not 100% effective. So if you have the vaccine, you can't be guaranteed to be protected. The vaccines are about 95% effective against mild to moderate disease, and a little bit lower against 95 against severe disease, and a little bit lower against mild to moderate disease. But there will be a small number, and these would be people that have immune systems that don't respond as well. That would be older people, people with underlying medical conditions, or on some sort of immunosuppressive therapy, for example, for cancer or for autoimmune diseases. So those people need to be careful. And there is a way of testing, and I've been advocating this, and I will be doing more of it in the media in the coming days, of testing people that are vulnerable to see if they have antibodies. It's a very simple test to test if you have antibodies, and that will it'll give you a good index of whether you will be protected or not. And the authorities here haven't grasped that.
Antibodies from your vaccine, is
yes.
it? Right.
Or from infection. And
or from having had it, yeah.
Yeah, so there's another interesting bit of statistic that I gleaned actually from a journalist. Actually, it's from a journalist in Boyle. Rachel Lavin, who writes for the Business Post, and we contact each other. She contacts me about her articles, but she also feeds me information, which is very useful, because I was speaking to her on the phone 2 days ago. She told me about this data that she had seen on a website from the UK. It's the National Statistics Organisation. It's really important data, because what it showed was the level of antibody in Britain in people, and the predictions of where that was going to go to. So right now, about 92% of people in England have antibodies against the virus.
Okay.
What does that mean? So 72% of people, this is adults, 72% of adults in Britain are vaccinated. So there's another 20% that have the antibodies that haven't come from vaccination. It's come from being infected.
Yeah.
So that's telling us that 92% of people are potentially protected, adults.
Right. It also tells us that many more people than even knew they were infected
Exactly.
infected. So the numbers were much higher than we ever got to hear or know about.
And that may explain why the infections have plateaued in the UK now, because there's so many people that have got infected with their policy, even though, I don't want to give Boris Johnson credit for this, but the policy in the UK of actually opening the doors and saying, get on with it, may actually have played into their hands. And what it has done, the downside, of course, is lots of people have got infected, and some of those ended up in hospital, and some may have died. But the upside of it is that a lot of people who got infected and got immune are not going to get reinfected. So they're now in a position where they could be very close to what we call population immunity in the, at least in the adult population, but not the children yet. And of course the UK procrastinated on vaccinating children. They've now come out and said they're going to vaccinate the 17 and 18-year-olds, but not yet the under 16s.
Yeah, and a lot of people here, I'm sure, have children or grandchildren. I mean, what's your view now? As we've moved to the 16 to 17-year-olds, and the 12 to 15s will be able to register from next week. There may be a lot more hesitancy. I've heard an awful lot of people say to me, for instance, oh, I've read about fertility problems down the road, and I can't do that to my daughter or my son. I mean, how do you think it's going to go here? What's your advice? I think,
well, the first thing to say is that all the vaccines have been tested in children as well as in adults now. They've been tested in adolescents, but also in the US they're currently testing them in 4 to 12-year-olds. So, and those will show up any, serious side effects that are quite frequent. They won't show up necessarily the infrequent side effects, and they will
the things that might happen down the road.
Down the road. I mean, and we did have the situation 10 years ago with the pandemic influenza, where a number of adolescents got narcolepsy, and that was a very unfortunate side effect of vaccines, which we never want to repeat again. So there are serious concerns amongst some parents and children themselves about getting the vaccine, but you have to weigh that up against the possibility of getting COVID-19. Now, in the vast majority of children, it won't be a big issue, in that they'll get a mild disease or asymptomatic disease and they'll recover. But a small number, and it's reckoned to be about 4 or 5%, will get persistent symptoms that will persist for greater than 4 weeks, and some of them will get long COVID, about 2%. So that is, if you get long COVID, it is a very debilitating syndrome, which can leave you very, very fatigued and incapable of working or studying for weeks and months at end.
Does it mean that long COVID, does it mean that you still have COVID, or does it just mean the effect is lingering?
The virus is gone from the system, so you have the legacy of the virus. It's not fully understood yet, and our research group are actually looking at this. Lots of others around the world are as well, on what's the basis of the long COVID. but it's not known. But one of the theories is that the immune response to the virus is persisting. We know it persists after the virus is cleared, and that may be very strong in some people, and that's accounting for some of these symptoms.
Yeah. Now, some scientists seem to think that the flu, which we got off very lightly with last year because we weren't mixing with each other at all and we had our masks and our distancing and everything, that's going to come back in a big way this year. What do you think?
Well, I mean, the reason we didn't have it last year, because we were, as you said, we were all keeping apart, and it was a great year for flu, and a great year for not having flu because it didn't get a chance to transmit. I think it very much depends on what happens in terms of COVID and the restrictions. If the vaccines against COVID work and really work and eliminate or significantly reduce it in Ireland, then we won't have any further restrictions, presumably, and then of course flu has an opportunity to transmit again, so we will get. I don't think it's going to be any worse than a normal year. I mean, there's all these sort of conspiracy theories about flu being worse. I don't see it being any worse than it would be in a normal year. Mm-hmm. And the only risk that is if you got the two infections, COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 with the influenza, then that might be something that we don't know what the consequences of getting co-infections. And co-infections in the past have happened with things like HIV and TB, for example, where the syndrome is very severe. So if that was to happen, it could be quite serious. But I'm optimistic. I think that in Ireland, the big worry, that just the caveat in being optimistic, is the worry about another variant. So we have the Delta variant, which the vaccines, are not as effective against as they were against the original virus, but they're pretty effective. And if that Delta variant was to change again and make it more difficult for the vaccines to work, then we would have a problem. And the issue, of course, is that in Ireland we're close to vaccinating our whole adult population, and the same as most European countries in North America. But in Africa, India, and a lot of poorer countries, they've only immunised maybe 5% of the population. And there, the virus is still going to circulate, has a huge opportunity to mutate. And this is a global pandemic. It's not just a pandemic of Europe and North America.
We're not safe until everybody's safe. What areas of the world do you think are the ones that we should be really watching or helping?
I mean, Africa is obviously, remarkably, in the first year, Africa was very, apart from South Africa, the rest of Africa got away very lightly, mm-hmm. But now it's hit Africa with a vengeance. So there's some countries where it's really endemic, and the problem there is that the healthcare systems are just not able to cope with it, and people are dying without even getting into hospital, which would never happen here. But Africa is obviously a big issue. India, now the numbers are going down in India, but again, I think what's happening in India is that they quote the numbers that have been affected, and they say there've been 30 million people, but I estimate that is an incredibly underestimate of the numbers that have been affected in India. I'd say it's a few hundred million. So what's happening in India is there's a lot of natural immunity. So the reason it's plateauing and what happens is that it's always in the poorer communities in a country where people are living closest together, where you get the greatest transmission of the virus. Those people already got the virus. They've either died, I'm not being callous, or they've recovered and they're now immune. And they're not going to get it again with the same variant. Right. So unless we get a new variant, those people are protected. Now, a very interesting study from Brazil. There's a city in Brazil called Maynooth, and they had a very serious pandemic, and I don't know why it hit that city so badly, but at one stage, 72% of the population had been infected. Wow. They know that from antibody surveillance studies. And then the numbers dropped right off, and they had virtually no cases, and which is evidence for my assertion that natural immunity generated by infection protects you. But then the Brazilian variant came along, and the Brazilian variant is actually worse than the Delta, the Indian variant, and then people started getting infected again. Right. So that told us that a new variant could overcome the immunity that was generated by the virus. So that's my biggest worry going forward, even that we could get another variant that would spread throughout Africa and maybe India and the countries where South America is another area. I mean, some countries in South America, it's completely out of control now. Yeah, and I suppose we've all been just so beaten down with bad news, where hopes are raised and then they're dashed. I mean, how likely is it that such a variant is going to come? Well, there's definitely going to be more variants. Now, the good news is that the vaccine manufacturers are ready now. So the speed at which they made these vaccines is truly remarkable. I mean, people think they did it in a few months. In fact, they didn't do it in a few months. There was 10 or 15 or 20 years of research going on behind creating the platforms that they were ready to slot into.
Yeah, and I think China
it.
released the sequence or something literally weeks after they
6
discovered
weeks
it.
after
Yeah,
they had it ready.
Yeah.
But they could do exactly the same now with the new Delta variant. They have a version of the vaccine ready already. It's being tested right now in clinical trials. They don't have to go through the large trials they did before because the vaccine platform is the same. It's just the sequence is different of the virus. And that is ready to go in terms of it's already been tested, and then it will have to get approval from the regulatory agency. So we're talking about a booster shot in the autumn. Well, my aspiration, I hope, the booster shot will not be with the original vaccine. It'll be a new vaccine that will be designed to protect against the Delta variant. They haven't said that yet, but it's very likely that will be the case. And so, it's a matter of the vaccine companies and the researchers keeping up with what the virus is doing. So even if the virus changes again, it's not the end of the world. We can change that vaccine again and come in with another version of it. So I think we're here with SARS-CoV-2 for the long haul, but I'm much more optimistic now than I was 6 months ago.
What do you say to people, and I've met a few people who've said to me, it's all a big conspiracy, headed by Bill and Melinda Gates to reduce the population on the planet, and they're in cahoots with Big Pharma, who are going to be making vaccines for decades to come and selling them. What do you say to that?
I think it's complete nonsense, of course, but there's very good evidence that this virus emerged from animal species, and all the influenza viruses, the ones that cause the real problem, come from animal species, and nearly all of them have come out of China, apart from the
Did it escape from a lab?
No, it escaped from an animal, most likely a bat. And the pigs and ducks and geese and birds, chickens are a source of influenza virus, and that's where our viruses come from.
They eat the bat droppings or something. Is that?
Yeah, I know they eat the bats.
They eat the bats.
So the bats are part of the diet of certain Chinese communities and other animals that eat bats. So if you go to the markets in China, I haven't been, but
I have. Yeah, you see that dried bats hanging up and cats in cages, and
you see all sorts of animals, and the butchery is not very pleasant to watch, I gather. I mean, I've seen it on videos only, and the blood then it's infecting the humans when they splatter it on their faces and stuff. So transmission is facilitated by that sort of activity, and we wouldn't have that. That won't happen here, but nearly all these viruses that have come, the influenza, and apart from the one in Mexico, which was the porcine one, the one that came from the pigs, swine flu, all the rest of the flu viruses have come out of China.
Okay, so that kind of shows us why this is going to continue. Because
I mean, we inevitably are going to, unless they, stop the practice of be more careful in their practice of dealing with animals, you're going to get zoonotic spread of these viruses, and it's something that's been happening for a long time, and it's not going to stop. But I think the other thing that the pandemic has taught us is that we need to be really well prepared for the next one. I mean, we mightn't get another one for 100 years. It'll be our future generations that'll have to deal with it. But, we do need to be prepared. And to be fair to the vaccine manufacturing companies, they were prepared because they were working on vaccines for other diseases, and they just slotted in SARS, and it just happened to work. It was a lot of luck as well in this. But also to have research to do the tests to diagnose it, and the drugs to treat it. Now there's a fantastic new drug. It's that a company that actually manufactures here in Ireland, in Limerick, called Regeneron. They have just done a beautiful trial the last few weeks, which was announced a few days ago, where they treat people with COVID-19 in the early stages. What they did was they took families where there was one person that was infected, and then they gave everybody in that family this prophylactic antibody, which is an antibody that's made in the lab. And it stopped the infection in something like 90% of the family members. And, and the people then who didn't get the antibody, the controls, most of those got infected. Because the Delta variant, as I said earlier, is so transmissible.
So Irish Pharma is able to kind of take part in this, and
so it's a multinational pharma company, but it's got a base in Limerick.
Okay.
So that's another very positive development. that we have a expensive, I have to say, an expensive drug to treat disease now that we didn't have at the beginning of the pandemic. So the scientific response to this has been truly remarkable.
Yeah, and so quick. And I suppose that maybe that's partly what worried some people initially about the vaccine. They thought that maybe it was too quick, but certainly the hesitancy seems to have declined as time has gone on.
I think one of the things you have to remember is normally with a vaccine development, you'll have one or most two companies working on it, and they would be putting a small amount of resources into it. But with this, there was just absolutely billions fired at. The US government put huge amounts of money, even into companies that weren't US resident. And it was all parallel activity. There was 20 or 30 companies working on it. And it was first past the post happened to be Moderna and Pfizer and then the Oxford group in the UK with AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson. And there's another one now just about to just announced yesterday that Novavax, another American company, a very small company. I know the CEO. He had been involved in another company that failed, and he set up this. And it was a tiny company, worth nothing. It's now valued at 13 billion.
Right.
On the back of the fact, and they haven't sold a vial of vaccine yet.
Okay, right.
And they've just done a deal with Europe to provide 200 million doses of their vaccine. Novavax is the company. And they're going to be in the market in the third quarter of this year. And that's going to be another one and the clinical trials look fantastic. It's just as good as the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine.
Okay, so we could be getting a Novavax then for our booster, another name to add to the list of the names on the list. So, Kingston, when can we return to what we used to call normality? Like, will we ever be able to shake hands with each other again or sing in a group in a room like this?
I hope it won't be as long as people, might worry it will be. I mean, I would say that in a month's time, all the adult population that are prepared to get vaccinated in this country, which I think will be about 95%, will be vaccinated. And a good number of the 17 to 18-year-olds be vaccinated. And then the 12 to 15-year-olds, they won't all be vaccinated for school time. And I think this is a big mistake, another mistake I think the government are making, saying they're definitely going to open schools no matter what. I think what's going to happen is the schools are going to open and half of them are going to close again because there's going to be COVID outbreaks in every single one of them if they haven't been vaccinated. But after, I'd say, another month, when all the under 12 to 15-year-olds are vaccinated in this country, we will then be in a much better place. We will still have breakthrough infections in vaccinated individuals, but it won't be anything like the level, and we won't have the hospitalizations that we had in the last two waves. So, I think we're in a better place than is maybe painted in the media at the moment. And I think a bit of it is scare tactics to get people to buy into the measures of social distancing and getting tested. And I would say people still, you got to social distance, you got to get tested if you're potential contact. But there are others who argue, and the UK have looked at it this way, that it's time to just get on with it and not to worry about the disease in children. Although they're pulling back on this now a little bit in the UK, and they decided to go for the...
What about under 12s? Because we've talked so far down to the age of 12.
Primary school, it's very, very mild. And now, having said that, I did say that there were some... if you look at the numbers... there are about... I looked at the numbers this morning, actually, for the last 2 weeks in Ireland. And in the 0 to 4 age group, remarkably, still significant numbers of cases, and significant numbers in the 4 to 12. So I think there was around 800 cases in the 4 to 12 age group in the last 2 weeks in Ireland.
Wow, so they will have to wear masks, I'm sure, again in September. But is there an argument for vaccinating children that young?
I think the argument is going to be difficult to make for vaccinating someone that young. I think the US are going to do it. But the US have a very different attitude towards vaccination than we do, and as you probably know, having lived there, they force you to vaccinate your children if you want to go to school or even to kindergarten. You have to have a vaccine. So that won't happen in Ireland. There's a great resistance, and I agree with it. I don't agree with mandatory vaccination. I think you have to buy into it, because if you make something mandatory, there's nothing sure than you actually reduce the uptake rather than increase it. Yeah. So I don't know yet whether it's necessary to vaccinate children that young.
Okay. And mental health, was a big issue for a lot of people as well during the past 18 months, because we were separated from our loved ones. We didn't get to see family. There was babies born that people didn't meet. young people couldn't have relationships. I mean, how big an issue is that? I know it's not your field, but how do you balance that out with all the science?
Yeah, no, it's tricky. I mean, on a personal level, we have a daughter who's in Boston, and we haven't seen her for 18 months. And it's very sad to talk to your daughter by Zoom and not be able to hug her, even if she is a 30-year-old. So it is very tough on families that are split up, that can't meet each other because of, and those that are living on their own who don't have partners and are maybe vulnerable. It's really, really tough on them because they have had to cocoon.
Well, I suppose the question is, was it worth the restrictions to do that to people mentally? Was it worth it for public health?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've spoken to some people that are would consider themselves vulnerable, and they were prepared to isolate. They were prepared to not risk going to a restaurant even if they had their vaccine, and they just want to see the thing over and remain healthy and not get COVID because they have a genuine fear that they'll die if they get it. So I think people have it is very difficult in terms of the mental health, but I think that the way a lot of people look at it, I'm going to do this, I'm going to get through it, and I'm not going to get it, and I'm going to do whatever it takes not to get infected.
Yeah. What about sports then? Your own area that's been curtailed for such a long time, and it's such a great outlet for people. Do you think that should be allowed to come back in a bigger form?
I've made this last summer when the numbers were very low. I was making the case very strongly that GA and football and rugby and other sports, running, cycling, rowing, all those sort of activity, golf, tennis, that don't involve huge numbers of people congregating together, should be allowed to continue, especially for the younger generation. It's a huge part of their development, sport. And if they miss out on 2 years of sport, it's huge for someone's development. So I'd be a strong advocate. The trouble was that some of the activities that happened last summer when the sport was allowed to get back, involving spectators, sort of soured the whole case that was made for allowing sporting activity. I think they've learned the lesson this year, and I think we're going to see larger numbers. The other thing which I haven't talked about, but just briefly to mention, I'm a great advocate of this rapid testing approach to keep things like sports safer. So I was part of this testing group that reported to the Minister for Health, the Mark Ferguson testing group, and I'm now on a testing implementation group which is reported to the Minister for Health, and we're recommending implementation of testing at sporting events, but also schools, primary and secondary schools, and universities, and we're actually doing it in Trinity already. We've been doing it for 6 months. We've been testing.
And what test is that?
These are rapid tests. So the usual test for SARS-CoV-2 is a PCR test, which is a very sophisticated test, very expensive to do. It takes at least 24 hours, and it requires this nasopharyngeal swab, which is swab pushed down the back of your nose, which is not very pleasant. But it's not too bad, but some people just don't like it. But so what we do it on saliva. Okay. And we do a test which takes 2 hours, but there's an even more rapid test. The test we do is called a LAMP test, but there's a more rapid test called a lateral flow test. It's a bit like a pregnancy test where you can rub what's like a cotton wool bulb up your nose, then put it into some liquid. It extracts any virus that's there, and then you pour that onto the little strip, and leave it for 10 minutes, and a line will come up on the strip if it's positive, and then you're positive. Now this is not as sensitive as PCR, but if you're at the infectious stage of the infection, it will pick it up. So
I know there's been an awful lot of debate about that. Is there any sense that maybe it's too expensive for the government to say, okay, we're going to pay for every student to get tested every day going to college, every person going into a whatever,
Well, how much have the government spent on the COVID payments and restrictions?
Why do you think they're not doing it?
Well, it's not the government, to be fair. It's actually NIFET and the Department of Health have been and the HSE have been very resistant to it. And we, I know this, and I'm not speaking out of office because I was part of the testing group that had some HSE members on it. And this is in the public domain, so I'm not saying this confidential. And they were very resistant to our proposal of introducing rapid testing. But then the minister forced their hand on it, and he really does believe in it. So Stephen Donnelly is very much behind the testing and the rapid testing. And it's now at the implementation stage, and the group that I'm part of, that Mary Horgan is chairing, is putting in place the procedures to implement it at various settings, including schools.
Okay.
So this is going to happen. And unless, of course, the numbers go shrinking right down and we don't need it.
Yeah.
But if the numbers remain at a level that we need to continue to do it, it will be done in the autumn. It is slow. The wheels of getting things done is slow. Mm-hmm. And it's frustratingly slow for people like me, because I want something done yesterday all the time. And my colleagues, some of my scientific colleagues are very similar to that, but the HSE don't necessarily work at that sort of pace. So it's a matter of, I think they've bought into it now, and it's a matter of how they're going to implement it.
Where are they going to get the tests? Are they easy to get?
There are literally hundreds of companies making these tests.
Okay. All right.
And they've validated some of them have been validated in Trinity, and there are preferred ones now, and these are the ones that we're going to be recommending. Companies are already doing it. We interviewed several companies that during making our report to the minister, and companies told us that they just took it upon themselves to do it. They weren't advised. They just read the literature themselves and figured out this was the way to keeping their workforce safe. So they were testing their workers twice a week. Some of them set up tents in their car parks. Workers would come in on a Monday morning, have tested, and they weren't allowed into the building until they had a negative test.
Okay.
And the same thing on a Wednesday. And that worked. And several companies were doing this. So what we've recommended is a similar approach is used for all workplaces, certainly larger
and colleges, which will be the big one getting
colleges
back
exactly
in October. Can I just ask you, before I let you go, you work on a whole host of other things as well, and one of your own niches is looking for a cure for cancer, or a vaccine, is it, for cancer? Just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah,
Are we close to something like that?
Yeah, I mean, there is a vaccine for one type of, for prostate cancer, that did come on the market. Now, I didn't have anything to do with this one. I'll tell you about the one that I was involved in a second, which came on the market about 4 years ago. But it was a personalized medicine. It was a cell-based therapy rather than a conventional vaccine. It was just very expensive to make. And the company that was making it folded because it just couldn't make enough money out of it. So, it showed that it is possible to vaccinate against tumours and stop a cancer. So I'm involved in a couple of startup companies, and one of them was in the cancer vaccine area. Now, that company was set up during the recession, and we got seed funding, but we didn't get the second round funding that was required to take the company forward. So it folded. So I have another one now, which we just founded about 6 months ago, which is not in the cancer area, but it's in actually drugs for treating diseases like multiple sclerosis. So these are taking the laboratory findings and translating them into drugs that eventually. So this is really one of the motivations for doing what I do and going to work every day, is to actually hope to see something that's come out of my lab that might someday become a drug. And
if it does come out of your lab, it goes then to a big pharma company, or what happens to it?
No, I mean, we have the startup company. So I'm a co-founder with another 2 colleagues in the company, and venture capital has funded it, and obviously they have a share in the company. And then as we need more money, they will get a bigger and bigger share, and then the founders get diluted.
And you're only interested in the research part, not the shareholder part.
No, right? I mean, look, no, I won't lie to you. If I made money out of it, I'd be happy. But to be honest, most people don't make huge money. My colleague Luke O'Neill, who people might know from the media as well.
Never heard of him.
So he founded a company called Inflazome. He was involved in the first company I co-founded, but he founded another one, and it was sold for 350 million to Roche last year. Now, you might think he's going to get a share of 350 million. It's a very small share of 350 million. Because what happens is that the venture capital companies that put the money in, really own the company. The founders don't have much. But the motivation for Luke and myself really was about taking something that you've worked on and getting it into patients and showing that it works.
Yeah.
So that's the motivation for doing what I do.
Well, it's certainly a great time to be in the infectious diseases area. What would you say to young people, say maybe choosing a career in science? Why should they go into immunology and biochemistry?
Well, I mean, I get up at about 7 o'clock in the morning, and I'm usually in my office shortly after 8. And before COVID, I would rarely leave the office before 6, and I would have 10-minute lunch break. And I never felt that I was, I had long days. I mean, I was tired at the end of the day, but I'm so motivated by what I do that it didn't feel like a job. Now, there were times I would come home and I would give out to my wife about all the administration I had to do around certain things that would bug you, but the excitement of getting results and seeing data from your postdocs and PhD students is what drives you. I don't do the experiments anymore. I have a team of people who do them in the lab. But it's the excitement of looking at that data and seeing advances and discoveries is just tremendous. So to young people, it's a very exciting career where you're your own boss eventually, and you can, I've traveled the world on the back of being a scientist, and not in the last 2 years, I have to say, because I haven't been in a flight for about 18 months. But I would travel to conferences, 7 or 8 times a year, and then to collaborative meetings to meet people in Europe or the US as well. So a lot of travel. It might sound exciting. I don't like traveling, in fact, but I like the destinations when I get there. That's the exciting bit of it. And then meeting colleagues who are working on it and talking about your research and making presentations at meetings. It was all part of what we do, and that's the really nice bit about it. So for young kids coming into the field, science is a really exciting area. Immunology is a really exciting discipline within science. And in fact, since the pandemic, the numbers of students opting for immunology in Trinity has gone shooting through the roof.
Yeah.
Because they all see, they're looking at people like Luke and myself and others on the media, and they want to be, they see that we're excited about it.
There's been a lot of communication around science over the past 18 months, which wasn't there before. Do you think the schools do a good enough job in sort of relating science to the real world for kids? I
think some schools do a great job, and others, maybe don't have the resources to do it. When I was in Maynooth before I went to Trinity, and I was the dean of the science faculty there for a while, and I used to go around to some of the schools to do talks, about just the Kildare schools really, to do talks about science, and it was remarkable the interest there was in science and the questions you'd get from the kids. It was truly brilliant. So I think in our science degree we have a incredibly oversubscribed immunology. Within that, they take a choice at the end of second year on the omnibus entry, and they can go into various disciplines. But immunology is always oversubscribed. Yeah. So it is really, it's really one that captures the imagination and interest.
Yeah, no, it's been a wonderful period. Actually, my own daughter said to me the other day, because it's coming up for her age group now to get the vaccine, and she says, "I'm only getting a vaccine that's 100% effective." And I thought, this is great. They know all about this stuff now, which they wouldn't have before, And just final question to you before we let the audience ask questions. Who, in your field, do you, I suppose, idolise? Is there anybody you'd love to work with or meet? Anybody, any particular scientist?
Well, I'll start by saying that the person that inspired me to go into science in the first place was actually a teacher in the school in Wilson's Hospital, the school I went to. A guy called Tommy Johnston. He was a part-time farmer, part-time teacher, but was really inspiring, made biology exciting. And then I had a couple of great lecturers in Trinity. I did my undergraduate in biochemistry, and they were the biochemicals, the medical side of biochemistry was fantastic. And there was a guy called John Scott and another guy, Jim Mason and Graham Love. They were all talking about the biomedical side. So they inspired me to go and be an immunologist, really. And that was the inspiration. Who right now, there's a guy that I admire hugely, and that's Tony Fauci. And I've actually... I met Tony quite a few years ago because he's in the infectious disease. He's actually an immunologist originally, an infectious diseases person, but a lot of his work is in the immunology area. So I worked on HIV for a while, and he did too. So we would have met at meetings on HIV. This would be in the late 1980s,
And there's no
early
vaccine
90s.
for HIV still.
This is a remarkable thing,
Yeah.
you know. And I was working on HIV vaccines for a while when I was in London. After I left Mill Hill, but of course it was a complete failure, and it has been ever since.
Right, but that's how you met Tony Fauci.
Yeah. So Tony, you know, I mean, how he has resisted the Trump administration and managed to stay not getting fired from his outspoken comments. And I have to take my hat off to him as a politician as well as a scientist. But he's a brilliant scientist, and he's a guy that I hugely admire.
Bad boy from Brooklyn. I want to give him a round of applause. First of all. Okay, I hope some of you have some questions now. So I'll let, oh my goodness, hand up at the bottom already. Yeah. So I'll let Brendan bring the microphones around.
Thank you for your input. It's wonderfully inspiring to hear you talk. Straight from the front line. So thank you very much for coming to Boyle. My question is, why so much focus on the vaccine, so little focus on immune support? Why the first world response to a problem that's all worldwide?
Yeah, I mean, what you're getting at, I think, is perhaps why we're not helping to provide vaccines for the developing world. Is that the context of your question? Yeah, it's a very good one. And there have been calls for you probably heard about the 700,000 doses of vaccine that we're getting from Romania, which I think is, I mean, I take my hat off to the HSE or whoever has negotiated this. I think it's been a great coup for Ireland. It'll manage to vaccinate all our children, all our secondary school children. I think this response doesn't have to come from Ireland, or shouldn't have to come from Ireland. I think it should be a sectoral European and US-led response to the developing world. The developing world, like India, for example, there's one company in India that can make 100 million doses of the vaccine in a month. Right? So if they're given the resources, they can make enough vaccine, not only for India, but for lots of other developing countries. So it's down to resources. So it's up to the developed world to provide the resources to the other countries, like Brazil, which also has very effective manufacturing. It's just a bit disorganized, whereas India is well organized, very good biotech companies, and well capable of making lots of vaccines. So it's not a matter of us handing over our vaccine, our 700,000 doses to India. It's going to make no difference to India if we give them 700,000 doses. But if we give them 700 million or 7 billion from the European Monetary Fund, it will make a huge difference. And that's the solution to this. It's finance.
Okay, another question, please. Up here, Brendan.
I'm a bit nervous, but Kingston, I'm interested in you talking about your hospital getting a vaccination or something for MS, which is a really dreadful disease. And how near are you to getting a breakthrough? Or
well, to be fair with MS now, there's some very, very good drugs, especially for the relapsing remitting form of MS. The drugs that are being used to treat that are quite effective. We're at the very, very early stages. We've been working on this for maybe 10 years now. We're at the very, very early stages of, we've identified a new pathway that's involved in the disease. And we're at the process of making the drug now to block that pathway. So, we're about 12 months off a first clinical trial, and then so there's 3 stages of clinical trials. So the first one is safety, and then you've got a small efficacy trial, and then a proper one. So normally that would take 5 to 7 years, and maybe €100 million at the minimum to get through phase 2, and then through phase 3. You're talking about then it's big pharma. So as Carole was saying, so the companies, normally the small companies get bought out, and when they get into phase 2. So you're talking about a big pharma that has the money. It's hard to believe this, but the cost to make a drug today by a pharma company is between 2 and 5 billion, one drug. So the bigger the company, the more it costs, because they have more drugs in the pipeline that fail than the smaller ones. So it is hugely difficult to take something from the inception lab through to a product. So it's not trivial. But there is a new approach for treating MS, which is a bit personalized medicine, like I was talking earlier about the vaccine, which is actually comes back to where I did my PhD in, and that's called bone marrow transplantation. So what they're doing now is the immune system in MS and other types of diseases caused by overactive immune response. So what they do is they kill all these T cells in the person that has the MS, and they put back in new stem cells that create new T cells which are not as damaging. And they're really working very well. But of course, it's personalized medicine. It has to be done individually for every person. But it has worked very well in the States in trials.
Wow. Okay.
So big breakthrough.
Okay.
I'm sure it costs a huge amount of money then just to treat one person.
It does, but I mean, if in the US, if Medicare pays for it, and that was the problem with the cancer vaccine, Medicare wouldn't pay for it, so that's why it failed. But if Medicare pays for it, it's doable. I think for Ireland and Europe, it's trickier. I think there are some health authorities in some countries that can afford that sort of approach, and we're already using drugs here that can cost 20 to 30,000 a year for one patient, and sometimes even more. So that's the sort of order you're talking about. But it's, the difference between this and the drug that's used currently is the drugs you're using currently have to be treated for life. This is a one-off treatment. So you don't have to repeatedly give this person a bone marrow transplant. You give them a transplant, and some of them in the trials have remained disease-free for 3 or 4 years.
That's wonderful.
It is.
Sounds good, yeah. More questions? Anybody else got a question for Kingston?
Yeah.
Yes.
Or a comment, Kingston. Would you agree that this is my personal opinion, that they're trying, the pharma companies are trying to suppress a cure for cancer because they're making billions and billions of it?
I think a cure is a difficult word, although when it comes to the context of talking about cancer, because cancer is so difficult to treat. But there is a drug now, or a family of drugs, that are used to treat, in particular, these are called immune checkpoint inhibitors. They block the suppressive response of the immune system, making the immune system more active and able to kill the tumor cells. And they're incredibly effective against skin cancer. They work in about 50% of patients. They do have some not so nice side effects, but the side effects can also be treated. But these are almost like a cure. They're as close to a cure for any cancer that has come yet in the form of a drug. So it's a conspiracy theory, what you're saying, about pharma companies wanting to keep, not wanting to cure because they wanted to keep treating. Of course, companies want a drug that's going to treat someone for life because they're going to make more money on it. But companies that can find something that will cure someone will also produce that drug and charge lots of money for it. So I think that's a bit of a conspiracy theory.
Okay. Anyone else?
Thanks, Carole, and thanks, Kingston. I'm just curious, some of the comments that would have been made when COVID struck was that we dodged a bullet for the last 100 years since the flu pandemic. Do you think that there's a fear that, and I don't want to be a prophet of doom here, that we have to be very vigilant in terms of further viruses down the road, in terms of how we have to deal with the situation, both as a scientific community and as a society at large?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there was a level of complacency even at the early stages of the COVID pandemic, in that Europe were looking at what was happening in Asia and saying, "Oh, this is not going to happen to us." Even within Ireland, I mean, early on, when it hit Italy, there was a level here at it's going to be Italy, the poor Italians, and then suddenly we had the first case in Ireland, and reality struck that this is going to be a global pandemic. And I think we have to be ready, and that's what I was saying earlier. And we've been persuading the government here that they need to invest in the research infrastructure, specifically around infectious diseases. And the Science Foundation Ireland actually have money in the pot right now to fund an infectious disease centre, but it's supposed to be a north-south collaboration, and the north yet haven't got their money together. But when they do, and if they do, there will then be a call for a big infectious disease centre, which would leave Ireland in a better position to deal with. Now, every other country in the world, is doing the same thing. The UK have put a vast amount of money into building a huge infrastructure for exactly what you're talking about. To have a vaccine ready within months, to have all the tests ready within weeks, to have all the systems in place, how to diagnose, treat, etc., etc. So loads of countries are responding in exactly the way you're suggesting. So there's no complacency, let me believe you. It's being done in most countries.
You just mentioned China there, and just actually one of the questions that I did mean to ask you was, we've been looking at the Chinese and the Asians for years wearing masks, and we all always thought maybe it was to do with the pollution in Beijing and other areas. Could it be that they were ahead of us in terms of knowing about infectious diseases, and are masks going to be sort of part of our future, do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting question, because, again, it was something that myself and Luke and others were shouting about early on, that we were saying you've got to start wearing masks. And there was a lot of resistance to it. And eventually it was bought into. And, in fact, Ireland was incredibly compliant on mask wearing. But then, you may get... But the Chinese, as you're saying, and not just China, I mean, Korea and Vietnam and all the other Southeast Asian countries do this. In the flu season, if somebody has a cold or a mild flu that they're able to, they're not in bed, they're out and about wearing a mask.
Yeah.
And you see people on public transport, even the streets in China, Vietnam, wearing masks. So it's a cultural thing there that they've been brought up to do it, and of course it's sensible, and it does reduce transmission.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if nobody else has a question, just last chances. Any other questions? Oh, one more. Okay.
Just could you speak a little bit about the role of vitamin D in the whole big picture?
Yeah, I mean, vitamin D has sort of raised its head a bit. I mean, vitamin D is people say that it has functions that stimulate the immune system. But it's not the sort of the wonder drug, in my view, the wonder drug that some proponents suggested it is. There is some evidence, in fact, interestingly, in multiple sclerosis, that vitamin D can have some beneficial effects. And I was involved in a clinical trial that was done in St. Vincent's Hospital, where they were looking at high-dose vitamin D in MS patients, and there was mild benefit, is how I'd put it. And interestingly, the backup information that that was justified the trial was that you probably may or may not know that vitamin D is promoted by sunshine on your skin, and in people who don't get a lot of sunshine need to take vitamin D supplements. So people in northern hemisphere have a higher prevalence of MS than people in equatorial regions because of sunshine. So vitamin D does have an effect on the immune system that can affect things like MS. In the case of COVID, there were some trials done to see if it would suppress the symptoms, not getting the infection, because it will have no effect on getting the infection. Let me tell you, it will have no effect. It might have an effect on slightly reducing the inflammatory response that accompanies COVID, but none of the trials were conclusive on this, so the jury's still out on it.
Okay, I think we'll conclude it there. Thank you again so much for your insights and your knowledge. It was wonderful. So again, thank you very much to you, audience, as well. And as I said, great to be here in person. And that's the bottom line. Okay, good night.